Hello.
And welcome to Larry's Library.
Hello, welcome to Larry's Library. Previously on Swiss Family Robinson. Swiss Family Robinson, the family has been shipwrecked on a deserted island. They've been there for 2 years. They've been able to get all kinds of cool stuff off the ship and set up multiple homes that they live in on the island and tamed animals. And today we go with chapter 35 and 36, but we'll start with 35, the Dove-Cot and its management. My wife took care of my pigeons and approved of the plan of a dove-cot. Consequently, the wagon was immediately loaded with provisions and all that was necessary for an excursion of some days, and we set out for the grotto. As soon as we arrived, I chose that part of the rock next our grotto as the situation of our dove-cot, and as the rock, after the outside layer was pierced, became softer, we soon made an excavation 10 feet high and large enough to contain 20 pairs of pigeons. 2 perches ran through the whole length, and projecting out in front with a board nailed across, formed a platform which we protected by a slight roof. A door with a hole to admit light closed the front, and a rope ladder suspended from one of the perches enabled us to mount up and look after the inhabitants. It cost us several weeks of constant labor to finish the construction, fix the boards strongly in their places, cover the inside with a coat of plaster to prevent humidity, and arrange the perches, the nests, etc. "There is the edifice," said I to Fritz, "but where are the inhabitants? We must call into action all our knowledge to find a way to force our wild stranger pigeons to dwell in the new habitation we have provided for them. And besides, they must not only remain themselves, but must bring their companions with them." "It appears to me, father, that nothing short of sorcery will do it." "Sorcery or not, difficult as it appears, I am going to try it, and I have strong hopes of succeeding with the assistance you can afford me. It is to a pigeon merchant that I owe the secret which I am about to put into practice. I will not warrant its success, for I have never tried it, but it consists in perfuming a new dove-cot with anise. The pigeons, it is said, are so fond of the odor of this plant that they will return themselves every night to respire its perfume, and it is in this manner that they insensibly change their country life for that of the pigeon house." "Nothing can be easier," replied Fritz. "The plant of anise that Jack brought will do the business. We can break the seeds on a stone, and if the oil is not as pure as that of the chemist, it will not be less useful or less aromatic." "I think as you do," I answered, "and I am very glad that I permitted Jack to plant a root that appeared to me to be so valueless." We then proceeded to make the oil of anise. I rubbed the door of the dove-cot, the perches, and every place where the pigeons could touch either feet or wings with it. I then mixed a sort of dough with anise, salt, and clay, and after having placed it in the middle of the dove-cot, we put in the pigeons, which we had kept in willow baskets while their habitation was building. We shut them up with provisions for 2 days, and then left them to enjoy at their leisure the odor of the anise. When our boys had returned from our kitchen garden at the end of that time, we formally announced to them that the pigeons had taken possession of their new abode. In a moment they flew to the ladder in eager haste to get a sight of the new inhabitants. The 2 windows of isinglass which I had placed in the door were raised by the curious, and I saw with pleasure that, instead of being frightened at the new objects that surrounded them, our prisoners appeared to have become quite tame, and when I entered they took no more notice of me than a domestic pigeon would have done. 2 days more passed away, and I became curious myself to know the result of my sorcery. On the morning of the 3rd day, I awoke Fritz very early and commanded him to rub anew with anise the door which was made to rise up and down by means of a pulley. He did it, and we then went, without saying anything about our preparations, to awake the still sleeping family. I then announced that the day of liberty for our prisoners had arrived, and now they were to be free. All now took their stations. I gave the cord of the door into Jack's hands, and scarcely able to keep my countenance, I described a magic circle with a wand, and after having murmured a pretended conjuration, I ordered Jack to pull up the cord. The pigeons poked their heads cautiously out of the hole, then advanced on the platform, and suddenly soared up to such a height that they were lost to our sight. But in a few moments they again flew down and settled tranquilly upon the platform they had just quitted. This incident, which I did not expect, gave new proofs of my dealings in magic, and I cried out in the most serious manner, I knew very well when they flew up in the clouds that they were not lost. How could you possibly know that? Said Ernest. Because my charms have attached them to the Dove-Cot, was my answer. Charms? Cried Jack. Are you then a sorcerer, Papa? Simpleton, replied Ernest. Who ever heard of sorcerers? At that moment, the pigeons, who had been quietly picking on the ground, attracted our attention. The two Maluka pigeons suddenly quitted their European brothers and flew off in the direction of Falcon's Nest with such rapidity that soon they were lost to our view. Adieu, gentlemen, cried Jack as they darted away, taking his hat off and making 1,000 faces. Adieu, a pleasant trip to you. My wife and Frances commenced to deplore the loss of our two handsome pigeons, while I, preserving as serious a look as possible, stretched out my hands and, turning into the direction in which the pigeons flew, I murmured half aloud the following words. Fly, little ones, fly far, far away, till tomorrow you may stay, but then return with your companions. I then turned toward my family, who stood stupefied with astonishment, not knowing what to make out of my serious address to the departed pigeons. As for the other pigeons, they did not seem disposed to follow their companions, but appeared completely tamed. They had found the Dove-Cot of Europe with its shelter, and there they gladly remained. We passed the rest of the day in the neighborhood of the Dove-Cot, conversing on sorcery and the question of the pigeons. We often strained our eyes in the direction of Falcon's Nest, but nothing appeared. The evening came, and the European pigeons slept alone in their palace. We supped gaily and retired to rest in anxious expectation of the morrow, which must establish either my defeat or my triumph. We renewed the next day our habitual occupations, and though I felt a little doubtful about the return of the birds, I said nothing, but anxiously awaited the evening when, about noon, we saw Jack running furiously towards us, clapping his hands and screaming out, "He has returned! He has returned!" "Who? Who?" was eagerly asked. "The blue pigeon," he answered. "The blue pigeon! Quick, quick, come and see him!" We ran to the Dove-Cot, and besides the blue pigeon, we found with him on one of the exterior perches of the house his mate, whom he was endeavoring to persuade to venture into the interior. He would put in his head and then return to her until at last he prevailed, and we had the satisfaction of seeing her enter the pigeon house. My sons would have immediately closed the door, but I prevented them, saying that some time or other it must be opened. And besides, I added, how are the other pigeons to enter if we close the door? I begin to think, said my wife at last, that there is something extraordinary in this, and unless you have used some enchantment, I cannot comprehend it. It is chance, pure chance, interrupted Ernest. Chance, replied I, laughing. That will do very well for one time, but when the other pigeon returns this evening with his mate, will you think that chance? Impossible, answered he. The same phenomena could not happen twice in a day. While we were thus speaking, Fritz suddenly interrupted us. His eagle eyes had perceived the birds we were expecting. What do you say now, my little doctor? Said I to Ernest. Both pairs of pigeons have now returned. I do not know what to say, he answered seriously. It certainly appears very extraordinary, but as for any sorcery or magic being employed, I will not believe it. It gives me pleasure to see that you are not credulous, but if a third pair of Maluka pigeons should visit us today, would you call that chance also? Ernest did not answer, but his silence showed that he was far from being convinced. We returned to our occupations, leaving Francis and his mother to provide a dinner for us. We had worked about 2 hours when we saw our little Francis come running up towards us. When he came near, he drew up his little form, and bowing haughtily, commenced the following speech. Most high and mighty lords, I am here to invite you, on the part of my good mother, to come and behold the Prince of Pigeons, who, with his noble spouse, has come to take possession of the magnificent palace you have provided for him. You are welcome for your good news, Mr. Messenger, was the universal answer. We hastened to the Dove-Cot, where my wife, after cautioning us to make no noise, pointed out to us 2 superb birds, whom those in the interior were endeavoring to persuade to enter. I give up, said Ernest at last. My little knowledge cannot comprehend it. I beg of you, Papa, to explain all. I explained to him in detail all that we had done. Jack laughed heartily on hearing that his plant of a niece had been the charm which had so puzzled them, and I tried to persuade him to follow the example of Ernest and not believe everything so readily. The following days were devoted to bringing our Dove-Cot as near as possible to perfection, and we saw with joy that the new inhabitants were permanently settled and had already begun to construct their nests. I observed among the articles they gathered for that purpose a sort of long gray moss which I had seen hanging from the branches of old trees. I recognized it as being the same thing as exported from India as a substitute for horsehair in the manufacture of mattresses. The Spaniards make cords also of it, which are so light that a piece 20 feet in length, if suspended from a pole, will float like a flag in the air. I made this discovery known to my good wife, and one can easily imagine my news was well received, for it added another treasure to our domestic riches and afforded promise of some fine mattresses. We found from time to time in the soil of the Dove-Cot nutmegs, which doubtless the pigeons of Molucca had brought over. We washed them, and although they were deprived of their silky covering, we committed them to the earth without much hope of their ever germinating. Chapter 36. Jack's Adventure and Narrow Escape. A Fountain. An adventure of which Master Jack was the hero diverted the monotony of our existence, divided as it was between new constructions and provisioning our habitation for the winter. Jack had one day set off on an expedition, the intent and purpose of which nobody but himself had any knowledge of, but his absence was not long, for we soon saw him returning, covered from head to foot with a thick black mud, and dragging after him a bundle of Spanish rushes, likewise covered with mud. "Where have you been," said I, "to dirty yourself so?" "In Flamingo Marsh." "Why, what in the name of common sense were you doing there?" "Alas," answered the poor boy, as he heaved a deep sigh, "I wanted to get some Spanish osiers to make nests for the pigeons." "A praiseworthy intention," said I. "It was not your fault that the enterprise did not succeed well." "Oh, no. And if it had not been for these bundles of rushes, I should certainly have lost my life. I wanted some thin, flexible rushes. Those on the borders of the swamp were too large, and I advanced farther into the marsh, jumping from hummock to hummock, until I came to a spot where the only footing was a mass of soft, black mud. My feet slipped in, and I found myself up to my knees in the compound, and gradually sinking deeper. I commenced screaming at the top of my voice, but nobody heard me except my jackal, who came running up to me and tried to assist me by howling with all his might. "But why," said Ernest, "did you not try to swim? You excel all of us in swimming." "Fine advice, truly. I would like to see you Fine advice, truly. I would like to see you swimming in a swamp, up to your neck in mud, and surrounded by a thick forest of willows. When I perceived that neither my cries nor..."
What's the willow?
It's a kind of tree.
Okay, I thought I was talking about an animal.
No. "When I perceived that neither my cries nor those of the jackal produced any good, I endeavored to draw myself out, for I was sinking fast and had no time to lose. I took my knife from my pocket and cut from the willows that surrounded me 2 large bundles, and placing one under each arm, they served me as a sort of hold. I then exerted all my strength, and by moving my body, my arms, and my legs, I managed to raise myself up a little. All this time my jackal stood on the edge of the marsh, howling with all his might. I whistled him to me, and grasping hold of his tail at last with great difficulty, I reached terra firma." "God be praised, my poor child," said I, "that you have been preserved to us, but the risk was great, and that you may thank your jackal that you are alive." His mother hastened to wash and clean the poor adventurer. His entire suit was put to soak in the jackal's river, and we also washed the rushes, as I intended to make use of them. In their present condition, they were too long and hard, and we were obliged to cut them in several strips. I profited by the willows that Jack had brought to commence the construction of a machine that my wife had long expected of me, viz. a weaving machine. 2 rushes, split lengthwise and wound round with packthread so that they would dry without bending, formed 4 bars to make that part of the machine called the combs. I made my sons cut me a quantity of little pieces of wood to make the teeth for the combs, and when I had procured these first materials for my construction, I put them aside, saying nothing to anybody concerning their destination, as I wished the machine to be a surprise to my wife, and I proved insensible to all the ridicule showered upon my little sticks, which Ernest facetiously called toothpicks. "What are you going to make with all those sticks?" asked my wife with womanish curiosity. "Oh, nothing but a whim of mine," I answered, laughing. "I intend to make you a superb instrument of music, such as the Hottentots have, called a gom-gom. Let me alone, and I promise you, you shall be the first to dance to its melodious sounds." About this time our onagra gave birth to a beautiful little ass of its species. It was received with pleasure, for it not only added to our number of useful animals, but also afforded us a courser that in future time would make quite a figure in our cavalcades. I gave it the name of Rapid, as I designed him particularly for the saddle, and we saw with pleasure that his limbs were all beautifully proportioned. The approach of the rainy season and the remembrance of the trouble we had had in collecting our animals last year induced us to invent a method to render the service less painful. It was to accustom them to return to their homes at the sound of a conch, in which I had placed a bit of wood, like a flute. The pigs were the only ones that we could not manage. They were unruly and loved their liberty too much to be confined. We willingly abandoned them, as the dogs could easily bring them together if desired. Among the embellishments and comforts with which we had surrounded our winter habitation, we yet wanted a reservoir of pure water, which we were obliged to bring from the Jackal's River. The distance was too great in winter, and I wished to remedy the inconvenience before the rains came on. I conceived the idea of bringing a stream of water from the river to the grotto and to establish a fountain, as we had done at Falcon's Nest. Bamboo canes fitted into one another served us for canals. We rested them on crutches of wood, and a barrel sunk in the ground performed the office of basin. We proposed, when time permitted us, to give to this construction the elegance and perfection it wanted, but such as it was, it answered our purpose, and my wife assured me she was just as contented with the little fountain as if it had been built of marble and surrounded by dolphins and naiads spouting water from their mouths. And that's the end of chapter 36. Chapter 37 will be next, the approach of winter and wet season, invention of a new light and literary acquisitions. This has been Larry's Library. Have a good day.
Bye.